Hi, Pima Aztecs. We're ready to start Chapter 12, the Central Nervous System. I think I have 5 or 6 videos for this Chapter 12 over the CNS. See if our pen works. Yeah. So the Central Nervous System includes the brain and the spinal cord, and it functions, Central Nervous System functions as an integrative center and a control center. So you're going to integrate in the brain and spinal cord, you're going to integrate information in the form of action potentials traveling in neurons. You're going to integrate that information, and then you're going to send out information too. So you're going to control basically the homeostasis of the body. The endocrine system also helps control homeostasis. So in this cartoon, we have regions of the central nervous system. So I think, and I've italicized this because I want you guys to keep track of the different areas that we talk about. So we're going to have regions and subregions and areas within regions and structures within regions and functionalities within regions, and it gets really complicated. And as a student pointed out last week, said to make sure that everybody remembers that these structures and the delineations or the boundaries that the neuroscientists put on these structures, they're arbitrary. Everything is connected. If you're in the nervous system, you are all connected. So just keep that in mind. These naming of these different areas and structures just helps the neuroscientists study the central nervous system. So with that said, let's take a look at the regions of the CNS. So the first one we'll look at is the cerebral hemisphere. So all of this is the cerebrum. It looks like it's just pointing to one thing. Oh, sorry, I didn't draw that very well. But all of this is the cerebrum. And there's 2 parts to the cerebrum, and they're called hemispheres. So you have a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere. So if you're looking at this diagram, you would be looking at the left cerebral hemisphere. And then within the cerebrum, deep to the cerebrum, is this structure called the diencephalon. So this purple structure is the diencephalon. And some of you may notice that an important region of the diencephalon here is the hypothalamus. So if you have a hypothalamus, that means you have to have a thalamus within the diencephalon, and you also have an epithalamus. And then probably most of you guys have heard about this little guy right here connected to the hypothalamus. That's the pituitary gland. Well, in 202, when we talk about the endocrine system, we'll talk a lot about the pituitary gland. The second structure that we'll look at, or excuse me, the second region, adult region, because fetal regions are different, but the third adult region of the central nervous system is called the brainstem, and it has 3 parts to it. So the brainstem is a region of the CNS, and then within the brainstem you have this structure is the midbrain, and then you have the pons and the ever famous medulla oblongata. And then the 4th structure, the 4th region in the CNS is the cerebellum. That's this guy right here. And then the 5th region of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. So when we look at this cartoon, it's the same way we're looking at the last cartoon. So we're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere, and here's the cerebellum down here, the spinal cord. And then what they do is they take this piece, this kind of rectangular piece out of the cerebrum, and they bring it down here and enlarge it, and then you can see deep to the surface of the cerebrum, which is right here, are these structures, and we're going to look at their names. So the regions of the cerebrum include, or like the subregions of the cerebrum, include the cerebral cortex of gray matter. So they should have made this gray, but they didn't. But all this brown stuff, this is all cerebral cortex. So all of this that I'm outlining, this is all cerebral cortex. All this kind of, I guess it's like a tan. And then deep to the cerebral cortex is the cerebral cortex is called is made of gray matter, and then deep to the cerebral cortex made of gray matter is this white stuff called white matter. And then within the white matter, but not really in this cartoon, you have little specks of gray matter, and that's called the basal nuclei. So, and now we'll give the surface markings on the cerebral cortex. So you have these structures called gyrus, that's singular, and gyri is plural, and those are the ridges. So this part that acts as a ridge, this would be a gyrus, and then when you dive down into this kind of shallow groove, that would be a sulcus. So the brain is composed of gyri here, and then when you dive down in, that's sulci. Gyri, dive in, that's sulci, come up on a ridge again, that's gyri. So, and then you have to make the distinction in the brain between a shallow groove and a deep groove. So you can't see it in this cartoon, but there's a fissure that separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. That's a fissure because it's really deep. But these guys, these sulci, or a sulcus singular, they're a shallow groove. And then the cerebral hemispheres and the surface markings, they're divided into 5 lobes. So in this cartoon, this is the frontal lobe. So the eyes, your eyes would be somewhere in here. So this is the frontal lobe. This blue thing is the parietal lobe of the cortex. This area is the temporal lobe, so your ear would be around here, so hearing is associated with the temporal lobe.
Just a sec.
No, I'm not talking to you. That's funny, my phone just wanted to know what the occipital lobe was. Well, phone, I'll tell you. The occipital lobe is located at the rear of the cerebral cortex, and this is where vision is. And then there's also a 5th lobe, and that's called the insula, and I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. Oh, this just fills in the cartoon that we talked about. So look at these cool things, these little tools that you can use to grab a hold of the frontal lobe, and then this tool you grab a piece of the temporal lobe, and then you pull the 2 lobes apart and you look deep inside and you see the insula. So that's the 5th region of the cerebral cortex. And it shows these are the ridges, remember, these are the gyri of the insula. And then this guy right here, if you went down inside, that would be the sulci of the insula. Okay, now we said that there are gyri and sulci, or a gyrus and a sulcus. And you find those all over the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, or the cerebrum. But then some sulci get special names. So in this cartoon, you can see the frontal lobe is labeled, the parietal lobe is labeled. Here's the occipital lobe, here's the temporal lobe in purple. And then to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, you have this central sulcus. So this line running all the way down here is the central sulcus. And then anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus. Posterior to the central sulcus is the posterior gyrus. So here's the posterior gyrus, this whole thing. So it's a ridge. There's the posterior gyrus. Here is the precentral gyrus. That's their name of their region, but then we're going to find that it will have special functions in those precentral gyrus and postcentral gyri. And then it looks like I have one other note down here, the transverse cerebral fissure. So here's the cerebellum, and this whole thing here, all of this is the cerebrum. And if you want to separate the cerebellum from the cerebrum, you use a transverse cerebral fissure. So remember, fissures are really deep grooves. So there's a deep groove between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. This is a photograph of a human brain. So here's anterior to get your orientation. Here's posterior. And this shows you the longitudinal fissure. So I pointed that out earlier. This is a really deep groove or a fissure that separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right cerebral hemisphere. And then it points out here, here's the frontal lobe. And then it shows you the central sulcus. So we saw this on the cartoon. Here's the central sulcus that runs like this. And if you can find the central sulcus, then you know this thing right here, that's a ridge. This is all precentral gyrus. And then this is all postcentral gyrus. You just follow the ridge, postcentral gyrus. And here's a cartoon that puts it all together for you that we've talked about so far. We didn't mention these guys, but there's a parieto-occipital sulcus. Parieto-occipital, so it separates the parietal from the occipital lobe. Here's a lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. And then here's the members of the couple, you can see a couple parts of the brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata. So this is can you tell me what kind of section this is? Remember what kind of section this is? So here's the cartoon. If you said a frontal section or a coronal section, you'd be right. So all this tan stuff, this is all cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is made of gray matter, and that's mostly neuron cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. And then deep to the gray matter of the cerebral cortex is the white matter, so that's all this stuff. And white matter is mostly made of myelinated axons. And I don't know if you can see in the cartoon, but you can kind of see some lines here. So those would be the myelinated axons of the white matter. So this gray matter or of the cerebral cortex is real thin. It's only about 1/8 of an inch, but it's 40% of the mass of the brain. So it's very thin, but it's still 40% of the mass because look at all these foldings. So all that gives it all those foldings gives it a lot of surface area. What's in the cerebral cortex, you ask? That's the site of the conscious mind. That gives you self-awareness, which we're all working on and trying to get a little more self-awareness. It's always good. It's also the site of sensory perception. So where you sense your sense of touch, your sense of sight, hearing, smell, etc. It's also the site of voluntary motor initiation, so that's when you want to move a muscle. It's a site of communication, memory, and understanding. So there's a lot of functionality to the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. And then, so here, this would be the longitudinal fissure right here, separating so the way this is drawn, so this would be the right cerebral hemisphere. This would be the left cerebral hemisphere. And each of the cerebral hemispheres connects to the contralateral side of the body. So what that means is these tracks here, these axons traveling in tracks in the brain, the cartoon's not that great, but you can kind of see how they go from the right side over to the left side over to the right side. So what that means is the right cerebral hemisphere connects to the opposite or contralateral side of the body. And you probably have heard this, that, for example, if you get a stroke in the right side of your brain, that affects the left side of your body. That's because of this contralaterality of the brain. And then one other fact, all neurons in the gray matter of the cerebral cortex are interneurons. So they're not sensory neurons, they're not motor neurons, they're interneurons. So they connect sensory neurons and motor